Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you.
Christina Dalcher. Thank you for having accepted this interview with Lecturama.fr and Vibe magazine. We are pleased to be able to ask you a few questions regarding your book recently published by Robert Laffont. You had a lot of nominations for different literary prizes.
For my short fiction, yes.
Yes.
For my short fiction.
So my first question, as a researcher and neurolinguistic, how did you get the idea to write your story? Because I read that you seem not to be involved in the Me Too movement.
Well, I wrote Vox before the Me Too movement actually came into existence. So when I wrote this novel, there was no Me Too movement. It's not so much a question of not being involved in it, but the two situations were very different. Also, the Me Too movement is very much about this important ability of women to speak about sexual abuse, and those experiences. But of course, Vox is a completely different kind of novel. It doesn't really have anything to do with that. Also, just one small correction. I'm not a neurolinguist,
Okay.
Only a linguist. My character, Dr. Jean McClellan, in Vox, is a neurolinguist. She specializes in aphasia, or aphasie en français, and a particular type of aphasia. But my specialty when I was studying for my doctorate was actually phonetics and phonology and language change. So I have a very rudimentary, limited background in neurolinguistics, and that's sort of the difference.
So how did you get the idea to write this book?
The idea, it came from everywhere. It came from everywhere. I think when we write, many readers, many editors, they ask us this question. They ask writers this question, and the tendency is to think that we get this idea like a lightning bolt, and it's just one thing, one idea. But really, it's a combination of experiences. So partly, I had this idea that I wanted to work language and linguistics into my writing, because it's something I love, and it's something I know about, and it's very interesting. There's not a lot of literature, not a lot of commercial fiction where that has linguistic elements in it, that talks about this capacity that we humans have for language. So I've always wanted to work with that in my short fiction and also in my novels. Also, I kept this sort of very abstract idea of a word limit in my kind of cabinet of things that I wanted to work with. And then another thing happened. I saw a call for submissions from a small publisher. They wanted short stories that were written by women, and there had to be some certain qualities. The main character had to be female. The main character had to have a specific skill. And the entire plot of the novel, or the short story rather, needed to revolve around this skill that the main character had, the female main character. So I thought, oh wow, what if I have a linguist who's a main character, and then I make it a little ironic in a dark way, and I don't allow her to speak. So there's the irony. But I needed, of course, to have a reason for this situation. And that's when I started looking not only at the situation, aujourd'hui, maintenant, no, not aujourd'hui, but maintenant, in the United States, where women were speaking up, they were becoming very loud, they were protesting, they were becoming very strong, and I imagined that somewhere, someone was thinking, oh, I wish they would just shut up. Also, I did some research into a movement called the culture of domesticity that existed back in the late 19th century and then also had a sort of renaissance in the 1950s. And in this culture of domesticity, we saw a separation of gender roles, right? So men would work outside the home in the public sphere, women inside the home in the private sphere. And obviously, whenever you have, we have this saying, history repeats itself. So I imagined, and I asked myself a question, what if the culture of domesticity happened again?
Oh, yeah. What a crazy idea.
It was a combination of things, really.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So, you wrote a dystopia, which looked like dictatorships we knew, unfortunately, by the past. Did you think women represent currently a certain danger for those men who lead the society?
Oh, do women represent a certain danger? I don't know. I like to think that nobody represents a danger in terms of women and men. But I also think that there are small groups of people who are very, let's say, extremist. Obviously, in Vox, we have a situation where the entire country of the United States has been kind of taken over by this small but very, very powerful organization called the Pure Movement. And this organization is run by extreme fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, who want to take a step backwards in time and transport us back to those kind of gender roles that we see kind of spoken about in the Bible, for instance. So I think that to some people, maybe women represent a danger. To all men, no, absolutely not. Only to some.
And in your book, the religion is very is omnipresent.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
through this dystopia,
Yeah.
to promote this policy.
Well, as somebody who grew up in the United States, I am used to living in a country, in a society where there is a very clear separation between church and state. Obviously, in other parts of the world, this is not the case. We have this combination, this meshing of religion and state. Personally, I think this is a very dangerous situation. I think everybody needs to have the freedom to be to practice whichever religion he or she wants without the control of a totalitarian or an authoritarian government. That's the last thing we want. That is not freedom anymore. It's not freedom of religion. It's not freedom of expression. Not when a government or one powerful faction tells us what we need to believe.
What are your feelings regarding women's situation in the countries you lived?
Well, I've lived in different countries.
Yes.
As I said, I grew up in the United States.
Yes.
I have lived in England, and I've lived in Abu Dhabi, and I've lived for a brief time in Sri Lanka. And of course, I've also traveled quite a bit. So I've traveled to countries in the Middle East, I've traveled to countries in Central America, and I've traveled quite a bit in Europe. And cultures are very different, obviously. I think where you and I, being from France, being from the United States, we're accustomed to a certain type of equality, equal rights, freedom of movement, freedom of expression. There are countries in the world where, until very recently, women were not allowed to drive a car. If we look at Switzerland, nothing bad about Switzerland. My husband is actually part Swiss. But, for instance, women got the right to vote in Switzerland in the 1970s. I don't remember what year, But the 1970s,
Yeah.
that was very recent.
After the Second World War.
No, in Switzerland, no, it was
No,
much
yeah,
later,
yeah,
in the
yeah.
1970s.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So interesting, right? Because, you know, we're not talking about a country where we think of women as being very oppressed when we talk about Switzerland. But then again, before 1970 something, they couldn't vote.
Yeah. Incredible. You describe an horrible world where women should shut up. Do you think this could happen?
Well, I don't think that we're ever going to arrive at a time where, fingers crossed, right? I don't think we're going to arrive at a time where, in the future, where women have to, and little girls even, have to wear a bracelet that counts their words. And I certainly don't think that we'll experience a future where if they speak more than 100 words per day, they're going to get an electric shock. This is speculative fiction, this is science fiction, this is dystopia, this is fantasy. But you know, as in all dystopian fiction, what do we do? What did Orwell do? What did Aldous Huxley do? What did Ray Bradbury do when they wrote 1984 or Brave New World or Fahrenheit 451? They exaggerated reality. They created a reality that was unbelievable, but to kind of convey a message, right? To talk about the danger, for instance, with in the case of Orwell, to talk about the danger of too much power, a totalitarian government that controls information. With Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, we talk about the danger of eugenics, of separating people according to their intelligence, of conditioning people until they become almost robotic. With Fahrenheit 451, we talk about censorship, the burning of books, which of course has happened really in our history. In Vox, we talk about limiting speech. We have to look at all of these dystopian books, and we have to look at the metaphor, not necessarily the actual thing, the actual story, but the more abstract message that these books are delivering.
It could have an hidden message. Maybe.
Well, exactly. And as far as Vox goes, no. Will we have bracelets that count our words? No. But is speech being censored?
Yeah.
Now? Yes, it's already happening. And it happens from everywhere. It happens from all directions. We can't say that it's only men who are trying to silence women, because there are also women who are trying to silence men. Some, not all, of course. I mean, nothing is black and white. We can say certainly that the conservatives, the right wing, is trying to silence the left wing or the liberals. But we can also say the opposite. Look at what happens at universities in the United States. When a conservative speaker comes to speak on campus, the students protest, and sometimes they protest so loudly that the university says, no, we don't want you speaking here because you are conservative.
Okay.
Silencing can come from everywhere.
Yeah.
And let's not fool ourselves. To a certain degree, it's already happening.
Okay. You point out the power of words in your book. Do you think this represents the best way for women to defend their rights?
The power of words, well, I think that this is the best way for people to defend their rights.
Yeah.
It's very important. I mean, I believe wholeheartedly in the concept of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And that means no censorship. This is difficult because it also means that we don't allow censorship even when the person who is speaking says something we don't like. George Orwell is very famous for his quote about liberty, and I'm paraphrasing a little, but he says, if liberty means anything at all, it means the freedom to say something that another person does not want to hear.
Yeah, of course.
That's powerful.
Yeah, completely. As a linguistic and researcher at City University of London,
Yeah.
You work on the effect of phonological, articulatory, perceptual, and social constraints on synchronic alterations. Did your experience help you writing this book?
It certainly. So I have a very my dissertation was on language change, and yes, and all these different elements. This is not exactly the kind of linguistics that that I talk about in Vox. Fortunately, during my master's program in linguistics and also my doctoral program, I had to study much more than just phonology and phonetics and language change. I studied language acquisition. I studied how language is processed in the brain. I studied how words are formed, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, all these different aspects of linguistics, which is a very broad field. And so all of these things, I think, came together. One very interesting part of Vox, which is, to me, one of the scariest parts, is by denying language to small children, we have a potential problem that, I mean, it's possible that they will not acquire language. And I think, since we're in France, I can talk about a very famous case of an enfant sauvage named Victor of Avignon. François Truffaut, the film director, made an excellent movie called L'Enfant Sauvage about this case. From a few hundred years ago. A small child, a boy, Victor, was found, and he was alone. He had survived in the wild. He was a wild child, an enfant sauvage. And he did not have language because there is a period, there's a critical period. There's a period in which we as humans must learn our first language. Or, if we do not, we will not learn it at all. And in fact, Truffaut himself played the doctor in this movie who was trying to teach Victor, the young boy, how to speak and how to comprehend language. The end result was that it did not work. There was no success. So these cases are very, very rare. But as when we study linguistics, we learn about them, and we learn about language acquisition. And there was another case that we discuss in Vox about Jeannie, a little girl who was found in California in the early 1970s, and she was the victim of severe abuse by her parents. She was not allowed any interaction, any social interaction at all. And she was rescued when she was almost 14 years old. So a team of linguists and psychologists and doctors and researchers worked with this girl. They tried to teach her language, but she missed her critical period. She's still alive, but she has had to spend her life in an institution. She has no language, or virtually no language. So that is the very frightening part about Vox. It doesn't happen, it doesn't come to pass in Vox, but we can imagine, and this is the terrifying part, we can imagine that if this fundamentalist regime, if this pure movement kept going on for more generations, we might actually end up in a situation where women would not have the capacity for language anymore. And when we take our capacity for language away, we take our humanity away, because language is what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it could be the end of the humanity.
I think so.
Your book has been published abroad.
Yes.
What are the reactions?
Well, I think they're very good. I think they're very good reactions. The US and UK and German and Italian editions came out in the summer of 2018. And right now, in February and March of 2019, we have publications in Spain and France and Portugal and Poland and I believe Russia. I hear from people all over the world. They write me emails. They ask if I can do a small interview.
Yeah, nice.
Sometimes these are high school students. I had a wonderful conversation over Skype with a group of high school students in Germany
Oh, yeah.
who were in an English literature class, and they read my book for their class. It was so emotional. I couldn't believe it. And these young people who are reading my book on the other side of the world, it seems. So obviously, no one can write a book that everyone will be happy with. But overall, I think that this book has something for everyone. It's a thriller. It's a dystopia. It's part science fiction. It has some politics. It has some feminism. It has some sex. It has a little bit of everything.
Yes. So what a tremendous adventure.
I think so. I mean, it's the biggest challenge with this book is where do you put it? When you go to the bookstop, what shelf do you put it on?
So Lorenzo is a fictional, a friend you knew.
No, Lorenzo is. I have spent much time in Italy. Okay. When I was younger, I mean, I think my very first trip alone to Italy I was 19 years old because I fell in love with an Italian. No, so he's very different from Lorenzo, and of course this is in my past. But I think as a young woman, I had this kind of, I don't know, very romantic idea about Italy.
I felt that reading that. So,
and I think it's the same thing with Frenchmen, right? I mean,
the dream lover.
Yes, of course, but look at Charles Boyer, for instance. The actor Charles Boyer. I mean, many people might remember him. I mean, before I was born, women were all so in love with Charles Boyer, yeah? So I think sometimes we have these romantic notions, and yes, there's a little bit of personal experience, but mostly Lorenzo is fiction.
I was a bit curious.
No, it's okay.
So, what are your next projects?
Well, the book that is coming next is not a sequel to Vox. But it's got the same kind of idea. Once again, I looked at a movement that happened in the past, and I asked myself the question, what if this came back? What if this happened again? In this case, the movement is part of American history that not many people know about. It was the eugenics movement that happened in the early part of the 20th century. It was very powerful. The idea was that the government and society in general were trying to create like perfect people, very intelligent people, very fit people, very beautiful people. This was, eugenics, it's from the Greek. It means well-born. Yeah? And of course, most people are familiar with the idea of eugenics and the idea of creating a master race when they look at Hitler and the Nazi movement. What many people don't know is that there was this very similar movement in the United States well before the horrors that happened in Germany and in the Holocaust. So I'm again writing a dystopia, little science fiction, a thriller with a strong female character, and who has to live with her family in this world where there is this almost rabid interest, obsession with intelligence. After that, I'd really like to write a sequel to Vox.
Okay.
I would really I want to write 2 more books that continue the story of Vox.
Okay.
With using many of the characters, but pulling out some of these characters from Vox a bit more strongly, and turning the situation around a bit.
Okay, would be interesting.
I'm very excited about it.
Okay.
You can tell.
Okay. We'll see us each other next time.
I hope so.
Okay.
I hope so. I love Paris. I love France. Maybe next time I'll speak French a little bit better.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Christina.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.